Hello, Carlos.
Hello.
It's the most wonderful time of the year.
Ross is extremely perky.
That's all right. Thanksgiving is over. Yeah, on to Christmas. Or as I call it, Latinxmas.
My trees are up. My house looks like Santa threw up in it, but it's awesome.
Already?
Already.
From New York Times Opinion, I'm Carlos Lozada.
I'm Michelle Cottle.
And I'm Ross Douthit.
And this is Matter of Opinion, where thoughts are allowed.
That pause gets longer and longer.
That dramatic pause. I know. That's what I'm here for. So, we have talked a lot in our recent conversations about the 2024 election, what a new Trump administration might bring, how the Democrats need to rebrand themselves, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, a lot about politics and policies and parties. Today, we're going to do something a little bit different. And that is, we're going to think about the relationship between politics and culture. In particular, how the Trump era is felt in our art and our ideas, the things we read and watch and consume. So I'm hoping we can start by examining a few cultural artifacts of the Trump era so far, especially now that Trump era has officially been renewed and extended for a new season.
A new season.
I mean, it's multiple seasons, I think.
It depends what you call a season.
I think a Trump term contains...
To everything, there is a season, Ross.
Fair enough.
Yeah. All right. To start off, let's just get very specific here. Is there a book, a movie, an album, a show, an artwork, an exhibit, anything that to you feels sort of perfectly symbolic of the Trump era so far? Ross, kick us off.
So my general view is that the Trump era to date, and especially in Trump's first term, was defined by a kind of oppositional culture where culture making was done sort of sometimes consciously, sometimes less consciously, in reaction to Trump, against Trump, in the shadow of Trump, as opposed to, say, in celebration of whatever changes Trump was ushering into American life. And that is framing for my choice of a representative Trump-era work of art, which is Guillermo del Toro's movie The Shape of Water, which came out in 2017, conveniently the first year of the first Trump presidency. And then it won Best Picture in early 2018. And The Shape of Water, for those who haven't seen it...
I haven't seen it, sorry. I've never seen it. The only Guillermo del Toro movie I've seen is Hellboy, which I loved.
That's the... Oh, you haven't... Wow.
I'm guessing this is different.
You haven't seen... Okay, well, we won't be... You're trying to sidetrack me into other Guillermo
Don't get Ross down
del Toro
that
movies,
rabbit hole.
Let's stay with The Shape of Water, which is a movie about a mute woman played by Sally Hawkins, who works at a secret government laboratory in Baltimore, Maryland in the early 1960s during the Cold War, very significant time. And she is close friends with a closeted gay man who lives near her, a fellow cleaner at the laboratory who's African-American, played by Octavia Spencer.
What in the Sam Hill? No! You boys mind putting the trash in the can? That's what it's there for.
And the plot of the movie is basically that the U.S. military figure who runs the laboratory, who's played by Michael Shannon, who always plays either villains or people so tortured they might as well be villains, he brings home some exotic fishman creature taken from a South American river. And it's sort of a humanoid, amphibian, intelligent. It can communicate in some ways. And our heroine, the mute janitorial worker, falls in love with him. And then a sort of conflict ensues between her, we'll just say her intersectional coalition, and the forces of white male McCarthyite heteronormative patriarchy embodied by Michael Shannon.
What am I doing interviewing the fucking help? The shit cleaners.
And so this is a movie about that I think represents how wokeness conceived of itself how cultural progressivism conceived of itself in the Trump era as this kind of alliance of minority groups and identities united in defense of a literal kidnapped South American, it's a figure who represents the other with a capital O, right? And all pitted against the forces of white male reaction. And it's a Del Toro movie. It's very visually interesting. It is, I think, incredibly didactic and heavy-handed and absurd in its kind of political statement making. But I think if you were going to pick a date certain where the kind of cultural reaction to Trumpism gets going in full on its way to becoming, what we think of as wokeness writ large, you could do worse than picking the Academy Award ceremony where The Shape of Water won Best Picture. There you have it.
So this movie to you embodies the kind of woke culture, anti-white male / hashtag resistance culture that embodied especially the early Trump first term.
Yeah, and that this sense of sort of American history as itself a kind of nightmare story, right? That was, one of the many interpretations of Trump's original election was that this was sort of the return of the repressed racist darkness of the American past, right? Sort of bursting into the open in the present. And so what was needed was a kind of reckoning with how we had lived with Trumpism all along. So this movie was the sort of Cold War version of that sort of primal American narrative that then also shows up, obviously, sort of across lots and lots of other cultural projects and efforts in the subsequent years.
I'm glad you got reckoning out of the way, Ross. That is an absolute must word for Trump-era cultural products.
Yep. The idea that we're reckoning with the past that got us to Trump.
Michelle, how about you? Is it also a movie? What you got?
So I totally take Ross's point about a lot of the culture and a lot of the moments being a backlash or oppositional or whatever. But I'm disregarding all of that, and I'm going to look in a totally different direction from Ross's fancy pants Fishman film. And we're going to go with the good old Western macho Yellowstone TV series, of which I am, and Ross was, a huge fan.
I'm 0 for 2. I haven't seen this one either. Sorry.
It aired in 2018, and it is basically the story of this Montana ranching family, and it stars Kevin Costner as the aging patriarch who owns a chunk of land in Montana. It's supposed to be about the size of Rhode Island. And it's this kind of primal story of this family and their traditions being beset by the forces of progress and rich developers and greedy politicians and just basically modernity. It's like all dogpiling on this cowboy culture in the middle of Montana.
You can't be here. It's private property.
Well, this is national park.
That's national park. This is the Dutton Ranch.
So it's looking at kind of really basic American things like land and tradition and family and violence and bloodshed. So it's a little bit like a red state Succession, which this is a comparison I like to make because blue state America, and especially journalists and media types, loves Succession. Mm-hmm. And Yellowstone, almost nobody paid any attention to this, despite the fact that in the rest of America, it's been one of the highest ranked shows. It has exponentially more viewers, and people really, really kind of identify with a lot of these themes. And it seems very weird because it's this rich ranching family, but kind of beneath the surface, you have this whole, their lives and their values are under attack from outside, and they feel like they're being left behind. And I think this resonates with a lot of folks in the kind of broader country, even if the particulars are a little bit different. I mean, at one point, Costner's character runs for governor, and he basically makes his announcement by saying, "I'm the bulwark against progress."
I am the opposite of progress. I'm the wall that it bashes against, and I will not be the one who breaks.
And so, his daughters ask, what's killing Kevin Costner's character? And she basically says, the 21st century. It's very soap opera-y. In this show, if you're trying to take somebody down, you're not doing it with a hostile corporate takeover. You basically literally, somebody grabs a cooler full of rattlesnakes and throws it on their enemy.
Yeah.
Old Testament vengeance. And it is great TV.
But so what's fascinating about Yellowstone is everything you just described, Michelle. But then the further wrinkle is that the maker of the show, Taylor Sheridan, has very loudly protested against sort of right-wing Trumpy interpretations of his show. And I have a quote here from him talking about these things. He said, "Look, the show's talking about the displacement of Native Americans and the way Native American women were treated, and about corporate greed and the gentrification of the West and land grabbing. That's a red state show?" And the answer is yes, it is a red state show for all the reasons you described, but it is also basically sympathetic to both the cowboys and the Native Americans as against all subsequent claimants on the West. And then at the same time, obviously, it sets up Costner's character as an anti-hero, not a simple hero.
But a really hot, sexy
one.
Anti-hero you're pulling for. He's not Tony Soprano on some level.
Well, Tony, many people found Tony Soprano kind of attractive. I have been informed, reliable sources. Anyway, all I'm saying is that the show contains within itself some of the complexities that help sustain and push Trump forward
in those ways.
Maybe if you watch Yellowstone, you'll have a sense of why that might be.
I'm fulfilling my sort of, coastal journalist stereotype. I watched Succession. I did not watch Yellowstone. I've begun watching Ozark. Does that count? Does that get me any points?
I didn't really like Ozark. I didn't really like Ozark.
Although I've been told I have to try it again.
I love Jason Bateman and Laura Linney. They're both so great.
They're very good, but
I've watched the first 2 episodes of it so far.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll talk about it later.
Yeah.
We'll go there. But just for cultural understanding purposes, Carlos, give Yellowstone a shot. It's totally soapy, but I love it.
All right. No. Trust me. I grew up on soap operas. That is no problem for me. All right. I will play true to type again and choose a book as my pick.
A great American novel?
No, not at all. The exact opposite. Terrible American nonfiction.
Okay.
But anyway, there was a cluster of books that came out during the first Trump administration that became kind of a canon of contemporary explorations of race in America. And you had Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, came out a little bit earlier. Mm-hmm. White Rage by Carol Anderson. The New York Times' 1619 Project, first as a magazine, then as a book. How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. And I think I wrote about all of these myself when I was a book critic. But there was one book in this canon that sort of stood out for me for its just astonishing kind of oversimplicity. And it's one that came out in 2018. And was a bestseller then, but became a real sensation 2 years later during the summer of 2020. And that is White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And the premise of the book is that, first of all, white people are not individuals. They are sort of an undifferentiated racist collective, right, that is socialized to hate blackness and to institutionalize that prejudice in politics and culture and in business. Non-white people are almost entirely powerless. They rarely exist except to give white Americans opportunities to kind of explore racial reality, to help them know when they're doing poorly or when they're doing better. Ross, I'll see your reckoning and raise you a do better, which was another sort of standard refrain of Trump-era progressivism. What white fragility means is that once you reveal these realities to white people, they can't deal with it. They recoil in disgust. They can't cope with the truth bombs you've just unleashed. And their responses of, anger and guilt and tears just kind of recenters their experience and thus reinstates kind of white hierarchy and control. Now, what I love...
Is this why there was that whole thing about what white women crying was a thing?
Yes. This was part of it. This was absolutely part of it.
White women's tears.
And also the kind of the Karen... But what's amazing to me about White Fragility, if you actually read the book, I don't think a lot of people actually read it because it's very hard to read. But the logic of White Fragility is irrefutable. Any alternative perspective or counter-argument is defeated by the concept itself. So either white people admit their inherent and unending racism and vow to work on their white fragility, in which case D'Angelo was correct, or they resist those categorizations and question the interpretations, in which case they're engaging white fragility and only proving the point, right? So any dissent from white fragility as a concept is itself white fragility. So that kind of circular logic
undisprovable
is how you get thought leaders and bestsellers. So I picked this book because to me this was kind of peak anti-racism, peak moral preening, peak kind of reductive thinking in the Trump era. I don't want to, use a broad brush on all these books that I mentioned. Like I've written about them. I find a lot to appreciate in many of them. But this one to me just was astounding that it could achieve such success for the author given the quality of the argumentation. And that is something that happened between 2018 and 2020 for this book.
So that kind of perfectly speaks to Ross's kind of resistance culture thing.
Yeah. It became kind of a status symbol. The way politics people have the power broker in their Zoom background.
Yeah.
Like having white fragility on your coffee table was kind of a sign that you were with it.
Yeah. And this was obviously a part of Trump era culture that we, as people who write about politics or review books about politics, confronted sort of constantly in the second half of Trump's first term. I do think it is interesting how it does and doesn't sort of bleed out into movies, TV, and so on. I'm interested in things like, what happened to Disney movies, for instance, in the last 5 or 10 years, where there was a shift from having actual villains, like embodied villains, like Scar, or Ursula the Sea Witch or the Wicked Queen in Snow White, to facing kind of miasmic entities that you were supposed to overcome. Like if you watch one of the Disney movies that came out during the pandemic, Raya and the Last Dragon, right, which is set in sort of an alternate...
See, my household has aged out of that, so I missed that
Southeast Asia. Well, my household has not. And, it's in a way a classic Disney movie, but except the villain is literally this kind of mist that never sort of condenses into an active adversary. Or in the original Moana, there's a villain who's really just, a good deity, a good island deity who's had her heart removed. Or even, Frozen 2. I almost picked Frozen 2 instead of The Shape of Water. In Frozen 2, it's a Disney movie where the villain is the dead grandfather of Anna and Elsa, who has dispossessed the native peoples of their lands. He's not even an active character. And again, there's sort of miasms and mists and there really was a shift to kind of structural views of villainy in Disney movies in this period. So I find that really interesting, like how you can have these sort of theories of politics and social life and so on that manifest themselves in Robin DiAngelo or Ibram Kendi, but I think they end up influencing a pretty wide range of pop culture.
Fascinating.
So all the things that we've seized on here are sort of early to mid Trump first term, right? Except maybe the wider angle look at Disney films by Ross. But eras, whether in politics or in culture, are not always so neatly defined and cordoned off. For instance, what do you see as kind of the main differences or confluences between Obama era culture and Trump era culture? There was plenty of sort of identitarianism in Obama era culture, right? Think Hamilton, think Glee, right? These were like enthusiastic visions of representation and identity. How much is sort of a natural evolution and how much is a heartbreak?
I think there's a pretty jarring cut from the world of Hamilton to the world of Robin DiAngelo or Ibram Kendi, right? And I think very clearly Hamilton is about representation in which the represented groups, the, Black and Latino actors playing these parts are laying claim to the greatness of the American tradition. And the idea is that, the white founding fathers are actually universal figures. And very clearly, that's not at all what you're getting in the interpretations of American history that are offered in the Trump.
In fact, there was a Hamilton backlash afterwards, right? Where sort of people looked back on it with a certain disdain.
Yes, people were, like the West Wing, which we discussed in a recent bonus episode, hint, hint, listeners. There's a kind of left-wing critique of Hamilton as a neoliberal text, right? Which it was in a way. It's about the first Treasury Secretary, the Wall Street multiculturalism, right? I think with some of the other things you mentioned, there's a little more of sort of a gradual transition. Like Glee, for instance, anticipates The Shape of Water in certain ways, right? It's sort of like the cast of misfits and outsiders representing a sort of proto-intersectional vision of high school coming together. But it, in the end, is a more, I have not watched Glee all the way to the end, but I believe it's a more fundamentally optimistic view of what intersectionality means than the later view where it's like you really have to crush the patriarchy. You really got to do it.
I do think it's hard to parse out sometimes what is a reaction to versus kind of a harbinger of, or something that goes hand in hand. Like Trump didn't bring about Yellowstone. I mean, like the themes in Yellowstone are themes that were playing out politically as well. So another thing that has struck me in recent years, which is kind of the merging of rap stars with country music, like Post Malone and Shabuzi and some of these other folks have joined forces or just moved over and done country music, which, has always been in its own way kind of ultimate American music, but yet also increasingly has this very defiant, middle finger to government and the establishment and elites. And country music's been having a moment in the last few years anyway, in terms of like its cultural influence. So I don't think that's because of Trump, but I do think that it is a little bit of like the dissatisfaction of very disparate groups with this kind of system and the way things are. And they've come together in these really unusual ways.
Michelle, I'm glad you brought that up because we're going to take a little break here. But when we come back, let's follow up on that and think about how culture in the Trump era might evolve. Well, Michelle, you've moved us right along into starting to imagine what a sort of deeper Trump-era culture might look like. As Ross said, so much of the early Trump-era culture was oppositional. Certainly the example that I brought up of white fragility and that genre is in that vein. Now that Trump is here to stay, right? Now that there's really no such thing as a Biden era, right? Do you expect to see popular culture that is friendlier to, whether to him, doing a goofy end zone dance, or to kind of Trumpism more broadly?
Just to pick up on what Michelle was talking about before the break, I think you could make some kind of argument, right, that there is a kind of lower middle brow, fusionist, anti-establishment culture that without being sort of pro-Trump in any kind of formal way does represent something very different from the kind of oppositional culture we were talking about, which tended to be much more high middle brow, would-be Oscar bait movies and so on. You've got, I think a lot of professional athletes are always somewhat right-wing. That tended to be muted a bit when Trump was president and super unpopular. If Trump is more popular, I think professional athlete sympathies for Trump will become less muted. So that I feel like that kind of range of pop music and sports and so on becoming a little less pious and a little more sort of Trump friendly is something that we're likely to see for a little while, at least. I don't know if you get to a point where you can talk about something that is Trump culture the way we talk about Reagan-era culture looking back, right? When you look back at the Reagan era, obviously there were lots of artists and intellectuals who hated Reagan and who made him a villain and treated him as a fascist. But there also was just this huge boom of patriotic action movies that we think of as sort of Reagan-ish culture. And, I mean, we did have Top Gun Maverick, which was a huge hit and maybe was, in a way, sort of itself a kind of foretaste of Trump's return. But I don't know how far that goes. I mean, part of the issue here, too, is that Hollywood is so uncreative right now generally that it's hard to even know what a big shift in the Hollywood zeitgeist would look like, because all they're doing is making sequels and reboots. And
yeah, this year's Glicked is basically Gladiator 2 and a ripoff of a Broadway musical. So,
well, at least nobody had filmed Wicked before. But I'm curious. I mean, Carlos, if I can ask you, like, what do you read more novels, I think, than either of us do right now
combined?
Even though I guess I'm allegedly publishing a novel, but Carlos,
which I'm reading.
But Carlos is
not allegedly.
Not allegedly. In fact and truth, Carlos, are there sort of highbrow sources of culture in America right now? Not even highbrow, just like literary sources of culture in America right now that really matter. Like, were there novels of Trumpism, of the Trump era?
I'll mention a couple. One that I actually just read, like during Thanksgiving weekend. First, Barbara Kingsolver's Demon Copperhead.
Which is fantastic.
Oh, yeah. No, I thought it was great. It's a retelling of David Copperfield by Mr. Charles Dickens, but it was set in sort of opioid crisis Appalachia. And that to me feels like a novel of the Trump era in its substance without being overly preachy. And I say that in every sense of preachy. It sort of like skips over religion, and its politics are not as overt as, at least I didn't think they were as overt as some might say. The one that I think is very telling, it's a novel that came out in 2001, but the movie just came out last year. The novel was Erasure by Percival Everett, and the movie was American Fiction. I strongly recommend both versions of this story. And the premise is you have a Black novelist approaching middle age, fixated on writing stories, on American retellings of Greek dramas, right? And they are respectfully reviewed, but don't sell. And in the meantime, he sees a quote unquote Black novel, Weeze Lives in the Ghetto, that just completely overdoes every trope of like a Black underclass life and becomes a raging success. And he's so resentful of this. He's so pissed off that he writes his own version of a quote unquote Black novel, right? His agent kept telling him like, hey, they kind of want a Blacker novel than the stuff you write. So he wrote the like ultimate cliched, stereotypical Black novel. It's called My Pathology with an F.
And Mr. Lee, is this based on your actual life?
Yeah, you think some bitch-ass college boy can come up with that shit?
No, I don't.
And of course, the problem is it becomes a huge hit. And, he has to decide whether he's going to kind of live with that success or try to step away from it. So it's winking at you, but I think it's a really good movie and novel for right now, because it gets to this question that the left, the Democrats are facing, which is like, how deep do you go into identity politics as a kind of raison d'etre of what your party is about? That seems to have been a failure in this last election. And this novel creates a caricature of kind of the deepest version of that. So I would point to Erasure, even though it was published 20 plus years ago. And I would point to Demon Copperhead as kind of novels of the era. But I think it's way too early. I think the best novels about a period, especially a political period, take years or decades to actually come to fruition.
Well, or to your point about Erasure being 20 years old, or they're written as prophecies, right?
Yes.
I mean, I think the key novelist of populism as a broad phenomenon, or populism and like late liberal exhaustion in the Western world, is the French novelist Michel Houellebecq, right? Who starts writing his books 20 odd years ago.
Long ago.
And he's anticipating, male-female alienation, the rise of incels, the internet and pornography as sort of these deranging influences. And he sort of works his way around to doing a novel about, an Islamic takeover of France. But ultimately, like, the core of his work is about the kind of social relations in the age of the internet and the sexual revolution that gave us this moment. But he starts writing about it long before, Trump or anyone else sort of comes on the scene.
Even the American novels that people turned to early on in the Trump era were things like Philip Roth's Plot Against America and Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here, which were not necessarily the best work of either of the two.
Or The Handmaid's Tale.
But these were sort of...
Don't forget Margaret Atwood.
Speaking of subtle.
I can't forget. Yeah.
Here's another question for you guys. I feel like one way to look at the shift that has, if we can use the term, normalized Trump, and that certainly made it possible for a lot of people who didn't vote for him in 2016 to vote for him in 2024, has in part maybe been a shift from the Trump archetype being sort of dictator to the Trump archetype being hustler. I feel like a lot of the stuff, again, what you were talking about before, Michelle, with rap and country music and these kind of things, Trump contains multitudes, right? But one thing he is a kind of all-American hustler. And I don't mean that as a pejorative, right? Like that is a powerful archetype in American life that has a tremendous appeal across racial lines.
American hustle, baby.
And that, I wonder if, and it's different from the Reagan era. Reagan, whatever he was not a hustler. That wasn't his vibe. So it made sense that sort of the Reagan era in its peak produced movies about, muscled up American he-men defeating communists, right? But I feel like we'll know that that we're in a sort of Trump-friendly pop cultural era if we get a bunch of movies about hustlers, maybe, or a bunch of novels or TV shows or something that are sort of mildly celebratory in the way of like The Sting or, movies of that vintage. I don't know. That's just a thought.
If Trump had not been born wildly wealthy and entitled, he would have been like the Leonardo DiCaprio figure in Wolf of Wall Street, selling penny stock out of a strip mall at the beginning of the show. He would have just been hustling his way along those lines. So I can see that.
I was at the Miami Book Fair last month, and I did an event with Max Boot, who has just published a big biography of Ronald Reagan, which the Times just named one of its 10 best books of the year. And he said something that really stuck with me. He said that one time Reagan was asked, how an actor could be president. And that Reagan responded with something like, how could you be president if you aren't an actor? Right? That so much of the role is in fact a role, that you make yourself a character in popular culture. And Trump absolutely did that with The Apprentice. I'm hardly the first to ever say this, right? But I am in the camp that believes that there is no Trump presidency without The Apprentice and without the role that Trump played as that character. And when you talk about the hustle, Ross, I think the big moment, not a apprentice Trump, but real life Trump, that captures to me a lot of that is the debate he was having with Hillary Clinton when she accused him of not paying taxes. And what did he say? He said, that makes me smart. And that to me captures a lot of the kind of meaning of Trump as hustler in American life. Let me ask you one last question quickly here. It's been said that, and disputed, that politics is downstream of culture, right? The culture shifts first and it seeps into our politics. How do you see that in terms of the Trump era? Is Trump more a cause or a consequence of our cultural shifts?
Oh, I think he's a reflection of it. I mean, what does America worship? America worships celebrity. America worships money. He was a character before he was president, and the reason he gets away with a lot of things that he does that normal politicians can't get away with, is because people think of him first as a celebrity and a character. And so he gets judged by very different standards. He's a showman above all else. And I do, let me be clear. I'm one of these people who thinks that the showmanship aspects of the presidency are often downplayed by pointy-headed folks like us. I mean, I do think that Reagan was right to some degree. You can't do the job unless you have a kind of presence and are able to telegraph presidentialness, so to speak. So, yeah, I mean, all about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've already written this, but I think that Hegel was right, and that some
that's not pointy-headed.
It's not pointy-headed at all. Everyone loves Hegel. There are some eras in history where a figure, is just embodies the spirit of the age. So I don't think you can separate Trump. It's both. He's cause and effect at the same time. He is history, in a golf cart, right?
That is beautiful, Ross. That is so beautiful.
I'm pretty sure I'm stealing that from someone on Twitter, so I apologize for the plagiarism.
They can at you. Go at you.
All right. The Douthat phenomenology. That's great. We'll end that discussion there. When we come back, we're going to get hot and cold.
Woo!
All right, it is time for Hot Cold, and you all know what that is, so go ahead. Who's got it today?
I got it. 'Tis the holiday season, so I'm going to be both hot and cold, which is not the same thing as warm, on the enduring holiday phenomenon that is Wham's Last Christmas.
What?
This year, it happens to be celebrating its 40th anniversary. New releases, a lot of publicity. Well, first, I'm cold on it because for those of you of my generation, you know that it is like the ultimate cheesy 80s pop song. And here, I want to just play a little snippet for those who want to remember it.
Oh my God.
Walk with me.
Last Christmas, I gave you my heart, but the very next day, you gave it away.
So, I think we can all agree that musically it's a little bit cheesy, but as a true Gen Xer, I am red hot on the nostalgia value, and I'm always fascinated by what pieces of my kind of youth wind up enduring. And very few have done as well as this one. I think it's like something like 5 billion downloads. And, on social media, there was something called Whamageddon, where the kids were like, whoever goes the longest during the season without hearing the song won. And so, you'd be in a department store and it would come on and the kids would freak out and then they would all be out of the game. They have movies named after it. It's magic.
I will say as a very late Gen Xer, so I was,
You're
3 years old. I'm always trying to horn in, but it's a testament to the song's success that it's sort of implantation in American culture that for a long time I couldn't have even told you that Wham, created it. It just seemed like it had always existed as an artifact.
In the beginning, there was Wham.
In the beginning, there was George Michael, but it's just, to me, it just is.
Carlos, do you even know the song? You seem confused.
I know the song. I kind of fell asleep while you were playing it.
Oh my God.
I'm kidding. Yeah. No, just so I can say you have to wake me up before you go.
No.
Yeah, I knew Wham. I knew it. I remember it. I was alive in the 80s.
Congratulations.
In your honor, I will play it. I will hear the whole damn thing. Lovely to see you guys. And hey, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, whatever you celebrate. Amen to you.
Holly jolly.
Merry Christmas, Bedford Falls. Merry Christmas, guys.
Thanks as always for joining our conversation. Give Matter of Opinion a follow on your favorite podcast app and leave us a nice review while you're there to let other folks know why they should be listening along. You can always reach us by email at matterofopinion@nytimes.com or voicemail by calling 212-556-7440. Matter of Opinion is produced by Sophia Alvarez-Boyd, Phoebe Lett, and Andrea Betanzos. It's edited by Jordana Hochman. Our fact-check team is Kate Sinclair, Mary Marge Locker, and Michelle Harris. Original music by Isaac Jones, Efim Shapiro, Carol Saburo, Amin Sahota, and Pat McCusker. Mixing by Pat McCusker and Carol Saburo. Audience strategy by Shannon Busta and Christina Samuelewski. Our executive producer is Annie Rose Strasser.